Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Christy Fedora, and I'm the Director of Marketing for Developer Relations in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And I'm really proud to announce that this is the very first event in a brand new webinar series brought to you by EMEA Developer Relations. You can see the calendar for all of our upcoming webinars on the developer.salesforce.com website, as well as access all of our recordings on demand. We hope you enjoy our topics, and of course, if you have any to suggest, please let us know in the short survey that we'll provide to you when the session ends. We're going to begin today's presentation in just a minute, but first let's go over some basics. All attendees have been muted in order to keep our lines crystal clear. However, this session will feature a question and answer period, so just place any questions you want us to answer during the event in the questions panel you see here on your screen. Today's session is being recorded, and we will share the link on our Salesforce Developers YouTube channel, usually no more than a week after the event. Now it's time to begin. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Director of EMEA Developer Evangelism, Peter Chittum. Peter, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Christy. Hi, everybody. This is Peter Chittum. I do run the developer relations team here in the EMEA region. I'm also a developer evangelist. That's my contact information, my email address, my Twitter handle, and of course the Salesforce Devs Twitter handle. We do love it if you can give us a shout out on Twitter during the webinar and help us raise a profile of these webinar series. And my slide will advance. There we go. Now, of course, before we get started, we begin with the forward-looking statement. This simply states that you should not make any purchasing decisions based on any forward-looking statements that I or Christy may make today. Only make your purchasing decisions based on features and functionality that are currently generally available and in production in the platform. And of course, we at Salesforce developers are very active on the social channels. In addition to our Twitter handle, which you just saw, you can find us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and of course our YouTube channel as well as Salesforce developers. This webinar, as Christy said, will be recorded and we will post it on our YouTube channel a few days after the event is complete. And that brings us to our agenda. We are talking about Apex today, so we'll go through some basics and fundamentals about Apex. Of course, we want to show you some code, and then we want to talk a little bit about Apex testing as well. Hopefully that fits what everybody wants to see. And this is a beginning or intro Apex webinar, so we're going to be going through the very basics. This is definitely for developers who are new to development or experienced developers who are new to the Salesforce platform. Now, in building solutions on the Salesforce platform, we love that we have a part of the platform that can be where you can define custom functionality through configuration. These declarative tools give you the ability to set parameters, to do drag and drop configuration of user interface, and allows you to rapidly build features that have sort of general purpose functionality. Where you reach the limit of those features, this is where we can use programmatic customization. And that is precisely a place where Apex comes into focus. So if you look at what Apex actually is, Apex is an object-oriented programming language. It's running on the core Lightning platform. And if you're coming to Salesforce from another technology or another language, you're going to find Apex will feel very familiar, especially if you have some background with the C family of language. The syntax we use definitely is derived from that. We also allow you to have very easy access to the data layer. So things like searching, retrieving data, data persistence, are very easily cooked into your code. And I'll give you some examples of that a little bit later when we get to some of the actual code samples. When you write code on the Salesforce platform, including Apex, you write code against an API version. That API version is tied to the current major release. If you've seen some other intro information about Salesforce, we have 3 major releases on Lightning Platform per year. And so each major release, we increment that API version. And when you write code, when you write Apex, that code is going to be compiled and debugged and tested in our servers. So what happens is you write some code, you deploy it to our servers to then test and debug it to see if it works. And as you can see on the on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a little bit of a code snippet. You can see some familiar things if you look at that. So for example, let's get a little pointer up here. You can see the declaration of a class here. There's some annotations. There's a declaration of a method, return type, and other things. I'll go through some more specifics when we get to some of the code samples, but hopefully, again, particularly if you've used Java or C#, this should look very familiar to you. Now, every system, every programming environment has limitations. In Salesforce, you are running your code in a multi-tenant environment. So what that means is that the Salesforce app is essentially shared by up to 8,000 other Salesforce customers. And for that reason, we have to make sure that no single one of those customers, or tenants, in other words, are able to use more of the resources in a given transaction than other customers. A good way of thinking about this is that we are trying to protect your environment from other people's bad code, because I know none of you ever write bad code. You all are very clear on clean coding principles, on making sure you do good testing, on making sure that you're using best practices. So of course, you're not going to write any bad code, but we want to make sure that nothing that happens in someone else's tenant has a negative impact on your system. So we put meters on things such as the number of queries you can execute, the number of rows you can retrieve from a query, the number of statements you can do to execute DML, or rows that you execute DML against. We also have the other limited resources like doing callouts or sending email, or asynchronous Apex. All of those things are potentially limited resources that we have to make sure that no single tenant uses too much of. And so these are the things that we call governor limits. And the way that governor limits work are per transaction. So as a transaction is initiated against Salesforce, the governor limits meters start. And then when that transaction is completed, then those governor limits are ended. The next new transaction would start with a new set of governor limits. There's a small exception to this when you execute asynchronous Apex. The asynchronous context of that Apex will have its own set of governor limits. So, imagine a transaction coming from the client to Salesforce. That transaction has some governor limits, but then if it initiates an asynchronous bit of Apex, that asynchronous chunk of Apex will have its own set of governor limits. So where do you use Apex? The typical use cases are things like UI controllers, triggers. Triggers can be initiated by DML, in other words, changes to the database. They can also be initiated by our internal event messaging bus, which are called platform events. If you need to have a custom API endpoint, we actually get standard API endpoints for basic CRUD operations against any standard or custom entity. But if you need to do something special with your API, you can write an Apex class to do that. We also allow you to do batch processing, scheduled logic. These are both examples also of asynchronous Apex that I talked about earlier. So those are the typical use cases. And then of course you will want to know, why should you use Apex, right? In general, the use cases for Apex tend to be around when we reach the limits of the declarative or the configuration side of the platform. If you remember the slide back there where I had that 80-20 rule, should I just go back and show it again? Remember this slide here, 80-20, right? So that 80% that you're gonna work on, that could be something like a validation rule. You might use a process with Process Builder. There are other types of rules like sharing rules and approval processes. For other code-based functionalities, so for example, if you're building custom user interface with Lightning components, either Aura components or Lightning Web Components, there's a standard feature called Lightning Data Service to interact with Salesforce. If you need something a little bit custom, then you can use Apex. Same thing with those standard APIs. I mentioned those. You can write Apex to do a sort of a custom API. And then in Visualforce, which is our legacy custom front-end framework, there's something called standard controller that allows you to interact with Salesforce. So in any of those cases, there are basic limitations that you can exist around using those things. And essentially, once you reach those limitations, that's where you break into Apex, for instance. All right, and then this just kind of takes us back to that whole thing about, if you don't have to write code, don't. If it makes sense to write code, so again, if one of those declarative features doesn't meet your specific requirements, or if it's just going to be too awkward to use that thing to meet your requirements, then by all means, go write some Apex code. We want you to do that. That's why we have it. But as the modern programmer proverb says here, code you don't have to write is code you don't have to maintain. So nothing wrong with that. And speaking of code, of course, everybody wants to probably see a little bit of code today, so let's jump in and see some examples. We're going to start out with kind of the basic core declaration of the two core Apex artifacts. The first is a class. As we said, Apex is object-oriented. If you're in the UK, you may want me to say object-orientated. I know that's the preferred way of saying that here. Whichever way you say it, though, we use classes and objects. So you can see here that we're declaring the class Awesome Merchant Service, and we're making that a public class, which is going to be pretty typical for code running in your own environment. The with sharing thing here, that actually has to do with something called sharing rules. And so basically, you can declare or specify in configuration which users get access to which records. If your code needs to respect that user access, then you would declare it as with sharing. You can also explicitly set it to without sharing. So in other words, ignore the sharing rules. If you're doing something in the background process that might have more access to data than the user normally would, that's when you would use without sharing. So that's our class. Triggers are essentially like a database trigger, but moved into the application tier. So we declare the trigger, give it a name, we specify what entity it's going to execute on, in this case, the merchandise custom entity, and then which operations will it capture. So this is just using after insert. You can declare other things as well. All right, so here is a more fleshed out example of the contents of an Apex class. You can see the second thing, or the first thing in there is a constructor. Now, typically, if you have an empty constructor, you wouldn't actually declare it explicitly. That is an implicit feature of the language, but we're calling it out here just so you know that there is a way to declare a constructor almost identically to how you would do it in Java, for example. We have some other methods here. So the hasData method is returning a Boolean type. It's also static. And the createData is an instance method that has no return type. It's set to void. So again, all of this feeling very Java C#y if you look at it. I mentioned the easy access to the data persistence layer. In the hasData method, you can see this bit of code in here. This actually isn't Apex. This is something called SOCL, or Salesforce Object Query Language. And the story here is that in a multi-tenant environment, we need to not let any tenant run any blocking operations against our database. So things like create tables and alter tables would do that. So instead of actually making any direct modifications to the physical schema of the database, we're abstracting that into a virtual schema that runs, that is the Salesforce object schema. There's a great bit of information about that in the Salesforce multi-tenant architecture white paper, so go take a look for that. But essentially, we use SOCL because we're not directly interacting with the RDBMS. Now, the other thing in create data, you can see that actually this object, merchandise, merchandise C, you can see that it's actually been surfaced automatically as an Apex class, in fact, or an Apex type. So what's nice about that is both in the case of this inline socle we have, and when we reference it as a class, we are going to reference check this against the actual schema. So anybody attempting to modify the schema will be blocked in your org because you're referencing it in code. Same thing will happen with any of these field names here, like name, price, and quantity. Any attempts to change those field names will be blocked as well. And then just to, again, show you the ease of use of data persistence, there's just a simple insert syntax that we have here for merchandise. There is a more complex syntax where you invoke a static method of the database class to do an insert, in which case you can actually handle whether you will block the entire save if one record isn't saved, or if you want to allow single records to fail. So there's a second syntax to do that, but this is the more simple one. In this case, if one of these two merchandise records failed, neither one would save. We talked about triggers. I mentioned that these are basically database triggers. So of course they execute on inserts, updates, deletes. They can also execute on undelete. And there's both a before trigger cycle and an after trigger cycle. Essentially, if you want to make modifications or if you want to check the data on its way to the database, then you could do the before. If you want to handle the data after it's been saved, but before it has been committed, then you would use an after trigger. And you notice that validate appears in either case here. My own personal best practice, and what I would say is probably the best practice, is most of the time you want your validations in the after trigger. You can still block the save transaction and roll it back because the commit hasn't happened yet. And you also have the benefit of having the data bend to the database, and any transformations the database may make on it will already be there and available to work with or validate against. And part of the reason for doing after triggers as well is any information that you might need around IDs or audit fields, that will already be in the record, and so you can reference that. So here's an Apex trigger. We kind of talked about the syntax for declaration. The one thing I will call out in addition to that is how we are accessing the data through this trigger.new property. So trigger.new is the list of records that initiated this save operation. In this case, it would be an insert operation that would execute this code. And the reason we set it as a list is that we don't want you executing code once per every record when perhaps you have hundreds or thousands of records. So we do an automatic batching. You notice that in the previous example, we were saving a list of merchandise, right? So we're operating on lists in both cases. And so if that list is up to 200 records, this trigger would execute a single time. If it was more than 200 records, it would execute once per 200 records. So if it was 600, it would execute 3 times. A couple of quick best practices. Best practice of 1 trigger per S object type. There's no way to set precedence in trigger execution if you have multiple triggers on the same object. So in general, set one trigger on your object, and then the next best practice, the last best practice to have a handler class is how you could do diverging logic, whether it's an update, an insert, a delete, or whether it's before or after. Finally, always execute on multiple records, as we saw in that code example. All right, we're going to wrap up here with a little bit about testing. Testing in Apex is a required feature. It's built into the framework. And that testing framework has a few rules around using it. The first thing that you should do is make sure that you are always planning and or writing your test as you build your business logic. You can do test-driven development with Apex. It is a little bit tricky in that in order to save your Apex code for your test, Any methods that you might be trying to execute need to exist. So essentially, you'd have to stub out your methods, then write your tests, and then go back and flesh out the contents or the implementation of your methods. But you could essentially do test-driven development that way. As far as code coverage, 75% code coverage is the bare minimum to deploy Apex into production. And that is a bare minimum. So in general, the best practice is to aim for 90% or above. I hear a lot of people saying, always I want to get 100% code coverage. That is definitely a great thing to have. Sometimes it is impractical, or it is going to take you more effort to reach 100% than maybe it's worth in that particular instance. In that case, just always make sure you have a buffer so that you don't end up with a scenario where you maybe have to push a patch last minute to fix a bug that's been found in production. And then in addition to having to refactor code, you also have to refactor your tests just to address that hotfix. So give yourself a buffer, aim for 90%. If you can do 100, go for it. So here's some Apex tests written in this warehouse data install test class. A couple of things I want to call attention to. The system.assert methods are how you actually execute your test. When system.assert is false, it throws an exception. When system.assert equals, there's also an assert not equals. So if any of those come back with a false, you get an exception. If true, everything's fine, right? So in this instance, provided we have some data, then oops, that went forward by accident. We're going to check to see if we have data. If have data is true and that is false, then we have a successful test. We also have this instance here where we create some lists of data and insert it. Just like we have our triggers working on lists of data, we should also test lists of data. And so that's an example of using that. Finally, down here, we have an instance where we're using test.startTest and test.stopTest. Now, these do two important functions. The first function is it isolates the governor limits of the code in between start test and stop test. So if your setup here is going to heavily use governor limits and your code execution that you're testing will also heavily use governor limits, you want to make sure that the governor limits of the test setup don't impinge on the governor limits of the real live code. And so start test and stop test do that. The other thing that stop test does is when you execute it, it will automatically invoke any asynchronous code synchronously rather. So that ensures that if you have batch Apex or other asynchronous code, it will execute and then you can test the results. All right, so a few best practices here. You should always generate your own test data. Notice that we do that in all of these examples here. Notice that we also don't do any data cleanup. And the nice thing is that the test framework will automatically roll back data that you set up for tests. Just good testing best practice will always include both positive and negative tests. I showed you testing with multiple records. Make sure you're exercising your governor limits. If you're doing multiple records, you'll typically be doing that. And then there is a way to, we don't show it in the code today, but there are ways to test different user configurations where you can basically in your code set up a user and then run your code as that user. And this just ensures that your code is executing correctly with the right sharing restrictions. All right, now this brings us to, that's kind of the core of what we're going to talk about today. If you want to go get hands-on with this, go to Trailhead, go check that out. There's also a sample gallery, and I just realized that this QuickStart is the wrong link. That's the Salesforce TX QuickStart. There is an Apex QuickStart, so go take a look for that. Maybe we can dig it up in the Q&A and post that in the chat. And with that, I'll say thank you. Please make sure to fill out our survey. It should be coming your way after the webinar. And with that, let's do our questions and answers.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Peter. So not only do we have a intro to Apex module that you referenced on Trailhead, but we also have a project on there, which is a quick start. So if you just go to Trailhead and you search for Apex, and then you can filter by what type of user you are, but in particular, and I think Peter will go and show everyone now how to do that. In particular, if you filter for beginner as your type of user, then you'll find those two things on there for you. So you can get hands-on with giving Apex a try yourself. Now we do have some questions from the audience while you're typing. I can share those with you. So Anitha would like to know something about how to debug Apex. So in particular, she says, how do I put a breakpoint in Apex code and step through the code using the developer console?
Sure thing. So there's actually the original way that we would debug was using the debug log. You could basically set different views of the debug log that would allow you to go and see when particular debug statements were mapped to certain bits of code. Now, more recently, in the last year, we've also rolled out the Apex Replay Debugger. This is a free feature. And essentially what this does is you run your transaction and then it stores the metadata about the transaction, and you can then step through the transaction as if it was running and go through it in the same way that you might do with a live debugger in another programming language that had a local runtime. So it's kind of, it is the best solution today for a developer to go through and do a sort of virtual debug operation, even though we can't do a live debug on a local environment. If you imagine doing stopping the runtime for a multi-tenant environment, you're going to upset a lot of tenants because it's going to be stopping and starting all the time. So we can't quite do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. All right, great. So we've got a couple more. I want to answer Heidi's question first before we go any further. And this is a question for me, actually.
Awesome.
So Heidi is driving right now, and Heidi's on hands-free and being as safe as possible, I'm sure. And Heidi would like to know if this recording is going to be sent out. Yes, Heidi, you will be able to see it on our YouTube channel for Salesforce developers. And I believe because you have registered for today, you will also be sent a follow-up email with a link to the recording, although I can't promise that, but you can definitely find it on the YouTube Salesforce Developers channel.
Safe driving, Heidi.
Safe driving, Heidi. Okay, so now let's move on to another question from, and I apologize if I get the name wrong, Chaitanya. So this question is about, can we port code from other applications like C squared plugins to Apex API, etc.?
Can we port code from other applications like C# plugins to Apex? So there's some interesting things going on right now in the community. There's actually one developer who has created something called Apex Sharp. It's a C# transpiler that will take C# code, transpile it to Apex, and then take Apex code and transpile it back to C#. So if you are a C# developer and you're sort of thinking, I'd like to write some C# code and have it run in Salesforce, you cannot do that today, but you could maybe explore that Apex Sharp project. It's an interesting thing that has kind of cropped up in the community the last year and a half. As far as doing direct port of C# code into Apex, you can't just copy paste. It is syntactically very similar, but there are some things that are fundamentally different about how C# works, which is really a general purpose programming language, versus how Apex runs, which is very much a domain-specific language for Salesforce, is what I like to call it. So yeah, so not exactly, but there may be a solution that'll get you just about there.
Excellent. Okay, so now Dan has asked if you can link GitHub version control to Apex.
So, GitHub version control is GitHub version control. So what you would have is a remote directory, and that remote directory, you can clone that and then deploy it. In fact, so one of the things I mentioned was our sample app gallery. And if you want to see this in practice, so this is the sample app gallery live I'm showing right now in the window. At least hopefully everybody should see that. And each of these sample apps, actually, you can go and see the Git repo for that sample app by clicking on View on GitHub. And a good one to start with might be Dreamhouse, for instance. This is one of our oldest, actually our oldest sample app. And so in here, of course, if you dig into the Force app directory, you'll see classes, and those are Apex classes. So what are you going to do to go and use this? Well, essentially, you're just going to do a git clone, and then you can use the instructions in the Dreamhouse repo here for how to go and use the Salesforce TX plugin to deploy that to a Salesforce environment that you can use to look at it, to practice with it, to hack on it, and to make changes to it. So there's no direct to Git link per se, but we play very, very nicely with Git. Although that being said, the Salesforce DX architecture is meant to work with any version control system. So if you are using some other version control system that is not based on Git, you can still use Salesforce DX for your work.
Excellent, Peter, thank you. Dan actually has a second question where he's being a little bit more specific here. He says, I was looking for ways to download all of the code that is already in our Salesforce instance so that I can search efficiently for code I'm looking for and then dump it into GitHub. I found some documentation, but the methods described in it are very outdated and no longer supported via a force.com plugin for Eclipse. We tried VS Code as well, but it wasn't clear.
Yeah, so basically the Visual Studio Code plugins, let's take a look here. That's actually, yeah. So the way that you're going to do that is using one of the metadata API commands, which is MD API retrieve, and the work-intensive side of it is basically constructing the manifest file so that you can go and retrieve all of the metadata, all of the code from that org. If it's just Apex code, it's going to be fairly straightforward. Your manifest file will just reference Apex classes and Apex triggers. But if you want to get the full footprint of that org, it's going to be a bit more extensive. The metadata API guide can give you some assistance on how to build that. Another way to do it potentially is to actually create a change set and then reference that, create a package and then reference that package as a way to download the code that you want. So it's a little bit work intensive today, but it definitely can be done. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Subias says, what's the best way to use formulas in Apex?
To write them. So formulas exist in a number of different places. You can use formulas when you do validations. You can use formula fields. You can use formulas in approval processes, and formulas also exist. Excuse me. Formulas also exist in Process Builder and Flow Builder. So those are all places where the formula language exists. If you're using Visualforce, Visualforce has a formula language, so does Lightning Aura components. Lightning Web Components did not bring a formula language into their architecture because of a very strict separation of concerns for what the template is supposed to do and what your JavaScript code is supposed to do. But there's a bunch of different ways that formulas play into customizing Salesforce, from very declarative things like validation rules to code-based things such as your Visualforce code.
Okay, perfect. We have a new one from Anudeep who says, is there an easy way to convert VF page to Lightning components than rewriting from scratch?
No, the whole architecture of a Visualforce page is really based on what was state of the art kind of in the 1990s going into the early 2000s, which was server-side compiled user interface that then output HTML. Now, certainly there are current frameworks that do server-side compilation. React certainly has that. Angular has that. However, the architecture of the Lightning component framework is to use client rendering exclusively. So as of today, they are so fundamentally different in how they're architected that there's really no way to just sort of magically wave a wand over your Visualforce page and have it be re-implemented. The other reason you'd want to probably not do that is that Visualforce pages, the way that Visualforce pages were built were very monolithic in nature historically, and very few people actually adopted and used the Visualforce component architecture that actually existed. It wasn't really popular. So I think it would be really hard to take that monolith and somehow break that into a component-based user interface, such as exists for Lightning components, whether that's Aura components or Lightning Web components. So no, it's, identify what your requirements are, map out how you can implement that in the framework, and then go build. The nice thing is, if you're going to build that in Lightning Web Components, it's a really nice, easy way to use UI frameworks. I'm finding I'm liking it more and more as I use it.
Nice one. Okay, so Deepak would like to know, apart from the developer console, what other IDEs can be used for Apex development?
So for Apex development, right now, the other two that I would look into would be Illuminated Cloud. Illuminated Cloud is a plugin for the IntelliJ IDE platform. And the other one that you could look into is the Welcome Suite. The Welcome Suite is, so Illuminated Cloud and the Welcome Suite are both paid offerings that you have to, those people are spending their own time and energy building those. And so there is a fee for use. But I've heard good things about each of them. I've used the Welcome Suite a little bit, and it seems very, very nice. Some of the developer experience features that they've built, and they're also aligning well with the whole Salesforce DX effort. But the same thing is true, I would say, for Illuminated Cloud. Scott Wells, who builds Illuminated Cloud, spends a lot of his own time and energy to make sure that it is an excellent development environment. So, those are the two that I would recommend looking into. If anybody knows of any other ones, then feel free to tweet them out and mention at Salesforce Devs. Those are the two that we're aware of today. So yeah, one of those two.
Perfect. I just want to spell welcome for people. It's WELKIN,
Yep.
and then suite is SUITE.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Last question, I think.
Great.
So it's back to, I think this is Dan, actually. So Dan says, if I have follow-up questions for how to use the SFDX command line, where's the best place to ask those?
That's a good question. So Salesforce DX team, well, let me go through the range. So for self-study, there are a couple of great Trailhead modules that you can go and take a look at. We are going to have a Salesforce DX webinar in the EMEA region in the very, when is that one? Do you recall, Christy?
No.
It'll either be April or May.
But look on developer.salesforce.com
Yep.
and see all of our planned events there.
Yeah, so there'll be another webinar, and there'll be a little intro there for that same format, about half an hour. Once you've gone through the basics, there are some other great resources. So I actually, I did a presentation at Dreamforce last year, which was basically practical uses of the Salesforce DX command line. So you can go take a look for that presentation at Dreamforce. You can also, for asking questions, if you're not getting something to work, I love Stack Exchange as a resource, so salesforce.stackexchange.com. If somebody's tried it, it'll be on there, and if they haven't, then you can ask the question. And it's a really good community for asking and answering questions. Anything else? Oh yeah, one last thing, and that is, of course, our own Trailblazer community. The Trailblazer community, there's a Salesforce DX chatter group in the Trailblazer community, and I know that team actively monitors that.
All right, perfect. I think that's all the questions we have. I don't have anything left in my panel, but based on the questions that you've just answered, do you feel like there's a gap maybe, or any other specific information you'd like to provide?
No, I think that's it for me.
Okay.
There's always the AskForce hashtag that you can use on Twitter. The Salesforce Devs Twitter handle for us at the Salesforce Developer Relations team. So just reach out to us and communicate if you have any questions or concerns, or we take praise too if you've got any of that. I'm not beneath asking for it. Yeah, I think just go out there and let us know also how we can help make you successful. That we always like to get that feedback.
Perfect. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. And again, I'll just mention that all of our events coming up are listed on developer.salesforce.com/event/lightning-platform. We will have other events coming up, but we basically have one per month up until June. So we've got a full and active schedule. I'm going to keep all the evangelists busy here in EMEA. And we look forward to seeing you at a community event or on social media again soon. Thank you very much for your participation, and please do be sure to take our survey so that we can get better at this. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.